Discussion Group. This is the final installment in our 7-part series, Politics, Pandemic, and Protests. This fall, we've been gathering virtually on Wednesday afternoons to explore the 2020 presidential campaign and the larger political landscape. I'm Colleen McCain-Nelson, and I'm a fellow at KU's Dole Institute of Politics. I'm also vice president and editorial page editor at the Kansas City Star. And before coming back to Kansas, I was a White House correspondent and political reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Now that the election is over, or at least mostly over, we'll talk today about lessons learned from a campaign season unlike any other. We'll endeavor to answer the question, what just happened? And perhaps more importantly, what's going to happen now? With the 2020 election in the rearview mirror, we'll discuss the deciding factors in this year's presidential campaign. What surprised us on election day? Were the mistakes of 2016 repeated in 2020? And we'll wrap up this election season with an assessment of lessons learned from the 2020 campaign and look ahead to what awaits the next president and Congress. Before I introduce you to our guest, I do want to mention that we plan to make this an interactive conversation. I have questions for our guest, but I want to give everyone a chance to participate as well. Later in the discussion, we will leave some time for our audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please type it in the YouTube chat box on your screen. And if you could hold questions until later in the program, I'll let you know when we're ready to have you start typing. Just a reminder that the Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. So please phrase your questions with this in mind. Questions that are distracting, disrespectful, or attempt to dominate the chat will be deleted and the user will be removed. Finally, before we move on to the program, I want to thank Newman's own foundation, which is sponsoring this series. Okay, off we go. We have a fantastic program today, and I'm eager to introduce you to today's guest. Jerry Seib is the executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the weekly Capitol Journal column. He was previously the Washington bureau chief of the Journal, and he reported on the Middle East for the Journal in the mid-1980s and covered the White House from 1987 through 1992. He has moderated 3 presidential debates and interviewed every president since Ronald Reagan. He's won the Miriam Smith Award for coverage of the presidency, the Aldo Beckman Award for coverage of the White House, and the Gerald R. Ford Foundation Prize. He was also part of a team of reporters and editors that won the Pulitzer Prize in the breaking news category for 9/11. In 2005, he won the William Allen White Foundation National Citation, and in 2009, the National Press Club's Award for Political Analysis. He's been a commentator on CNBC, Fox News, PBS's Washington Week, Face the Nation on CBS, Fox News Sunday, NBC's Meet the Press. And Jerry Seib is also the author of We Should Have Seen It Coming, From Reagan to Trump, A Front Row Seat to a Political Revolution, a new book that we'll be discussing today. And also with John Harwood, the author of Pennsylvania Avenue, Profiles in Backroom Power. I'll add my own personal addendum to Jerry's very impressive bio and note that he is, of course, a KU graduate. And I also was fortunate enough to call Jerry Seib my boss and colleague at the Wall Street Journal. So it is great to be back together, if only virtually. Welcome, Jerry, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. And you represent the best hire I made when I was Washington bureau chief. And I also want to note that I have my baby Jayhawk back on the bookshelf back there. So I do video work from this studio and a lot during the pandemic, and the Jayhawk is a guest at every video I do. So
I can attest that you are always representing the Jayhawk. So I appreciate that. So I want to start our discussion with a look at what happened on November 3rd and where we go from here. And then eventually we'll work our way back to some of the insights you share in your book and questions about how we got here. But as we talk about the election results, I want to steal your book title and ask, should we have seen this coming? Obviously, we got a different result than in 2016. Donald Trump did not win the election, but Donald Trump did get more than 73 million votes. And I think there were a lot of Trump critics who believed that 2016 was all just some terrible mistake and that a lot more Trump voters would have buyer's remorse in the 2020 election. So I'm interested, Jerry, in why they were so wrong about that and what the election results tell us about the entrenched divisions in our country.
Well, it's a really profound question. It is the question. I guess I would start by stepping back a little bit and saying, is it an amazing year, which is a statement of the obvious, but we had the coronavirus, we had an economic collapse, we had a summer of racial reckoning, we had the president get coronavirus, we had the death of a Supreme Court justice, we had an amazing array of events that you couldn't have made up in a B movie. Couldn't have had a script like that. Nobody would have believed it. And then we landed at election, and now we're in a post-election period in which we're going through something that I've never experienced or would have dreamt of otherwise. Having said all that, not that much surprising has happened. I mean, we knew what would happen during the coronavirus. We knew there were going to be massive amounts of mail-in voting because of the coronavirus. We knew most of those people would be Democrats because they were being encouraged to vote by mail. We knew Republicans were not being encouraged to vote by mail. We knew there would be lots of flux on election night and confusion about what the vote count was, and that the early votes that counted late in the American system would go to the Democrats. And so we'd have this swing back toward Joe Biden. And we knew President Trump was going to say, no, this is a rigged election. I'm not going to accept the results, because he told us for months that's what he was going to do. He filed a 500-page, his campaign filed a 500-page legal document in Pennsylvania in June saying the election is going to be rigged in Pennsylvania. That was before anybody had cast a vote. So on one level, what we're watching right now is shocking. On another level, it's really not surprising. So I think that I just mentioned that because I think it's useful to keep it all in perspective a little bit right now. As fraught as it all seems, it's actually playing out according to script. What is surprising, and Colleen, you referred to this in your question, is the margin by which Joe Biden won was certainly less than the polls would have suggested. And that tells you a couple of important things. It tells you that the Trumpism wasn't a fluke, and also that it's not going away. You know, the two biggest vote getters in American presidential history are Joe Biden with 79 million votes this year and Donald Trump with 72 million votes this year. So there was more resilience for President Trump. I actually think Joe Biden is literally the only Democrat who could have beaten him. And if not for the coronavirus, he probably wouldn't have beaten him. So we all have to, people who hate Donald Trump and all of us in Washington who just were convinced this wasn't going to work out this way, have to accept the fact that there's more resilience to the Trump message and maybe to Donald Trump personally than people thought all through the last 4 years. And the Republican Party is not going to be able to simply move away from Trumpism, and probably, frankly, not away from Donald Trump himself. So I do think there is a reality here in which Joe Biden can use this moment, which is weirdly suited for Joe Biden, who's a flawed character in many ways. But this is a moment where I think people actually will come to appreciate the fact they don't have to think about what the president says every day for 4 years. They're tired, and he will let them go. And you talked about kind of decent and civil dialogue. That's really, I think, what the country may be ready for. And so weirdly, this is a moment that may be suited for Joe Biden personally, but one shouldn't think that that means that we've moved past the era of Trump. I don't think we have.
Right. I mean, it's a pretty amazing rundown when you list all of the things that transpired in 2020. Yeah. And I mean, it's just kind of a dizzying kind of what should feel like a decade's worth of huge developments. And yet, as we watched the polls through the year, they were amazingly steady. You know, there really wasn't much movement in the polls. Obviously, the polls didn't match up exactly with what happened on Election Day. But I'm curious whether you can point to any particular inflection points along the way in 2020 that you think really mattered in terms of the final result?
Well, I point to one inflection point, which I think is just worth remembering because it was such an amazing moment. It was the South Carolina primary. And it is worth remembering how close Joe Biden was to political death before that South Carolina. I mean, he had miserable finishes in Iowa, miserable finishes in New Hampshire, miserable finish in Nevada. And then he goes to South Carolina and he wins in a walk, and it is an amazing political recovery. It's just a great story for one thing, but it also tells you the power of the African-American vote, the Black vote in the Democratic Party. And it came to the fore and it asserted itself. And that's not going to be forgotten. So that's one inflection point, I think. I actually think the other, and this surprised me a little bit. I think it is, if I think about things that shaped the race, I think about that first presidential debate. And you know, we in our profession spend a lot of time obsessing about debates. You know, I've moderated debates. They're important, and I think they're really an important political and civic institution, but they normally don't really change the race all that much. I actually think the first debate was a significant moment that hurt the president in real ways. Because he just didn't look presidential. He looked small. He looked angry, and I didn't think Joe Biden did all that well, particularly. But you could see a movement afterwards from people who had their doubts about Donald Trump, sort of had their doubts confirmed, and they moved toward Joe Biden. This is kind of the opposite of what happened in 1980 when people had their doubts about Ronald Reagan. He did well enough in that the one debate that happened in 1980. They all moved toward Ronald Reagan away from Jimmy Carter when they felt they were comfortable with him. Well, I think people got uncomfortable again with President Trump in that first debate, and they moved. And then I would say finally, and I think this is, you know, you and I lived through 2016 together, right? We remembered, we collectively, I think, didn't read enough into the enthusiasm that you could see at Trump rallies, and you saw that again at the end. And to the extent that I think President Trump made a comeback and nearly got there at the end, it's because he went out and he did leave it all on the field. And I think he tapped into enthusiasm. And part of that enthusiasm told you that the Trump campaign, though it fell short, succeeded in activating a new layer of Trump voters. So they really went out, they knocked on doors, they registered and activated more Trump voters. And you saw it in those rallies at the end. And that's why he came back in the end, I think, and came closer than we all thought he would.
I think that's a great point about the debate being an inflection point, because, as you note, so rarely do debates matter, and as people walked away from that debate feeling so exhausted by just having watched it, and I think it kind of underscored for people who might have been on the fence, if those people even exist, the people who want to not think about the president all the time and not feel exhausted by the president's Twitter feed. And I think that just kind of like brought all of that to life in one 90-minute exhausting debate.
Right, and I think exhaustion is a good word. I think a lot of people who are sympathetic to the president, even if they won't admit it, are just tired of it, you know, just exhausted. And that was one of the X factors. And Joe Biden just seems calm by comparison, and which is an odd thing to say about Joe Biden if you've covered him for 40 years. But that is one of the reasons why I suspect that Joe Biden has an opportunity here to kind of create a personal popularity by contrasting himself with Donald Trump. You know, David Axelrod, you know, an Obama advisor, likes to say that every president is a reaction to the previous president. And in a way, I think maybe people may be more comfortable with Joe Biden than they thought they would be, because he just represents an opportunity to exhale and to relax a little bit. And that might work to his benefit. And if he creates personal popularity, it may actually benefit him in an environment where the structural strength that he's got, his Democratic Party has, is not all that great. In fact, except for at the top line, Republicans advanced forward, didn't go backwards in this election.
So we've all spent the last couple of weeks slicing and dicing the election results, trying to make sense of it all. As you've been poring over the results, and I'm interested in what stands out to you as determinative factors, whether it's, you know, a particular state, whether it's the electorate changed in the last 4 years, or even campaign strategy, perhaps mistakes that Hillary Clinton made that Joe Biden avoided, or, you know, did suburban women make the difference? What stands out for you in terms of what happened in 2016 versus what happened in 2020?
Well, I think it's you have to start in answering that question by just talking about the votes of women. I mean, it's a huge gender gap. I mean, Joe Biden won women voters by, I think, 11 percentage points in the end, and Donald Trump won men by 5 or 6. So literally the entire Biden margin of victory came from women. And, you know, we kind of knew that was going to happen, but to see it in black and white is very significant. And I do think it was in particular suburban women. Again, we kind of all saw this coming, but you saw it play out. I mean, the reason Joe Biden won Arizona, hadn't gone Democrat since 1992, was because of suburban women in Maricopa County, more or less. And the reason he has a comfortable lead in Pennsylvania is suburban women in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And the reason that he won in Michigan by such a large margin, 150,000 votes, a lot of that is suburban women. I think that sort of shapes, I think, the Biden agenda, and maybe shapes the two parties. I think the other significant thing that happened was you see a shifting electoral map. I mean, you have Virginia moved from red to purple to blue over the last several election cycles. North Carolina and Georgia are making that same journey, and the South is just going to look totally different now. The South is no longer a solid red wall. And Arizona, it may be a sign of what's going to happen in Texas over the next couple of cycles. I think problematically, though, for the Democrats, when you look at the big upper Midwest states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and you look at Joe Biden's ability to win all those states, he didn't win them by much. And I think it's a mistake to think the blue wall of the industrial North, Midwest rather, has been rebuilt. I'm not sure that anybody except Joe Biden could have swung those states. And when you look at where the Democratic Party is moving culturally and ideologically, I think Democrats ought to be worried about that. So you're seeing a really interesting shift in the map. But I do kind of think in the end, the ability to piece together suburban women and enough traditional Democratic voters, that's the reason Joe Biden is president-elect. And I don't actually think any other Democrat could have pulled that off.
Right. Well, you touched on the idea that the results suggest that perhaps Trumpism isn't going away immediately. And obviously, you have the fact that Donald Trump got more than 73 million votes. You have the fact that he's already signaling interest in running in 2024. Of course, you have this whole cohort of Never Trump Republicans and Lincoln Project universe who were hoping that we could all just move on from Trumpism. Is there any reason for those folks to believe that the Republican Party is at some point going to revert back to a more traditional conservative worldview? Or is Trumpism the way forward for the GOP?
Well, yeah, that is the question for Republicans. I mean, they're going to have their own soul searching to do. And I think there are kind of three paths possible forward for Republicans. One is that you just stay on the Trump populism, nationalism path, and maybe even with Donald Trump himself. And if not Donald Trump, Tom Cotton or Mike Pompeo, those are people who would basically embrace Trumpism and keep moving down that path. Then there's the possibility of snapping back to kind of a more Ronald Reagan traditional kind of conservatism. And I think of Nikki Haley, for example, as somebody who's kind of fits more into that spot. And there are others in the party as well. And then there's the possibility of a third way, a kind of a middle way, in which you kind of take some blend of Trump populism, nationalism, but meld it with more traditional Reagan Republican instincts, and try to find a path that combines the two things. And there are people like Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio in the Senate are trying to do that, and some smart young conservative intellectuals around town are trying to do that. And I think that's a smart way forward. It's a way forward that says basically, look, Donald Trump was right that free trade isn't working for the new constituents. The new foot soldier of the Republican Party is the working class white male in the center of the country. And you know what? Economic globalization doesn't work for that person very well, and free trade hasn't worked for that person very well. And we should want to save manufacturing in this country. Trump was right about all those things. So let's find a way to do that. Let's actually have an industrial policy that we as Republicans and conservatives embrace. And industrial policy was anathema for conservatives for as long as I've been in Washington. But now they're saying, let's go ahead and do it. Let's use government power. Don't be afraid to use government power. Let's save manufacturing industries because they help save communities and they help the people who support us on cultural grounds. So there is a possibility to come up with a way forward for Republicans that blends these things together. I think their problem is that if Donald Trump is still the sun god and he blots out everything else, it's going to be hard to do that.
Right. He's certainly indicating an interest in remaining the sun god. But I am interested in the question of whether it's possible to have Trumpism without Trump. He doesn't seem to want to go away, but 4 years is a long time in politics. We don't know what's going to happen if, for whatever reason, Trump begins to fade away and is not center stage. Will you still have Trumpism without the man himself?
That's a good question. And I don't know the answer. I think there is a chance, and some of my colleagues here disagree with this, but I think there's a chance that Americans and Republicans, right? Let's leave aside Americans. Let's even talk about partisan Republicans, will find that they're more relieved than they thought they would be to not have to worry about what Donald Trump is tweeting every morning and every night. and that maybe he gets tuned out more than he thinks he's going to be, or than we think he's going to be, and that people kind of move on just because, they're tired of the show. That's a possibility. Trump will not go quietly, but people don't have to pay attention to him anymore. It's one way of looking at this, and maybe he kind of fades a little bit. It's hard to imagine Donald Trump fading because of the way he's dominated the conversation for 5 years, but I think that's at least a possibility. And frankly, I think it'd probably be healthier for the Republican Party. Second acts don't actually always work that well, particularly in the Republican Party. Nixon pulled off a second act, for example, and Ronald Reagan kind of did, but they tend not to go all that well. And so we'll see. I think the odds are better that Trump finds ways to continue to dominate the conversation, but I don't discount the possibility that people will be, there's this old George H.W. Bush, who I covered as president, used to tell this joke about how somebody was hitting himself on the head with a hammer, and then he stopped and he said, wow, I felt better than I realized when I stopped hitting myself on the head with a hammer. Well, maybe that's what people will think about Trump when they don't have to be hit by his hammer every day.
I like that analogy. Well, I saw that Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton told the Wall Street Journal recently that Republicans won elections down ballot because of Donald Trump, not in spite of Donald Trump. And I'm interested in whether you agree with that assessment, and whether Republicans should worry that they might lose some ground if Trump isn't on the ballot.
That is a really interesting observation. I saw that, obviously, he made that. I think you can argue that's true, but you can also argue the opposite. I think so. Here's why I say that. Let's start with the reality here that if you get past Donald Trump losing, and yes, he has lost the presidential election. If you get past that, Republicans had a great night, as I referred to this earlier. They probably I think they'll almost certainly hold control of the Senate. They just have to win one of two Senate races, runoff races in Georgia, and I think the odds are they will do that. They gained seats in the House. They picked up two state legislative chambers in New Hampshire, the only state legislative chambers that moved from Democrat to Republican, not the other way around. They maintained the status quo almost everywhere else. So this is a pretty good night for Republicans. And if everybody wasn't obsessing about Trump losing, that would be the storyline. So did that happen because of Trump or not? It's hard to argue that when you look at places like California, where the Republican Party picked up House seats, that was because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't have any coattails in California last time I checked. So I think there was a kind of a problem there for Democrats. I think this was people voting for Republicans, but also voting against Democrats, and voting against what they worry about as the kind of a excessive leftward drift among Democrats. And I don't think that's Donald Trump. I think that's people choosing Republicans as a safe harbor, and maybe consciously splitting their vote between Joe Biden at the top and Republicans down ballot. I don't see that as a Trump effect necessarily. Some of it maybe, but if people were voting down ballot for Republicans because of Trump, they would have voted for Trump at the top of the ballot too, and that didn't happen. So I think it's a different story than that, and I think it's got as much to do with people being worried about the Democrats as being enthused about Donald Trump.
Right. I did want to talk about Trump's unwillingness to concede and the consequences that cascade from that. We actually scheduled this final Dole Institute event of the semester months ago with the hope that surely 2 weeks after the election, we'd be done counting ballots and we would have disputes over the election resolved. And yet here we are. That was funny that we thought that. But I think as we see this situation play out in real time, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that what's happening is wholly unprecedented in the modern era. And I'm interested in what the consequences are from Trump not conceding, if any, and also your assessment of Joe Biden's handling of this situation. I mean, clearly Joe Biden could come out with his hair on fire and, declare that this is unacceptable and yell and scream and, but he's been very calm about this and said, we're going to begin a transition with or without Trump. If I can't get the official intelligence briefing, I'll bring in my own guys. But what are the real consequences of this?
Well, first of all, I think we're now at the phase where Republicans are playing with fire. I mean, you saw this in Detroit yesterday when two Republicans in the county canvassing commission were unwilling to certify the vote count in Wayne County, the city of Detroit, and the immediate environs, there was about to be an explosion. I mean, that was basically going to disenfranchise tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of African-American voters. I mean, that is a dangerous thing. And then, of course, as anybody who followed the news knows, they changed their mind after a couple of hours. And I think they figured out this was fun for a while, but it was about to explode. And I think we're now at a dangerous point. At the same time, I kind of think that we may have moved into kind of the Looney Tunes part of this, the legal challenges here in the last day or two, because you literally had yesterday the Trump campaign going into a court in Nevada, asking a court to simply throw out the entire election in the state of Nevada and declare Donald Trump won, and to unseat all the Biden electors and seat the Trump electors. I mean, it's breathtaking if you think about it. And essentially, Rudy Giuliani was making the same argument in Pennsylvania yesterday. Let's just forget about the 700,000 Pennsylvanians who voted, and let's throw it all out and turn it over to the state legislature. That's not going to happen. But there is this fantasy dream, whatever you want to call it, that I think Giuliani is pushing, and some Republicans have embraced, that, well, maybe we can create enough doubt here that the election will be thrown into the House of Representatives and there will prevail. I think that's fantasy as well, because if you let's look at the actual situation right now. In all the 6 states, and I'll try to remember all these right now, that were close: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. Joe Biden is winning in all of them. Not some of them, he's winning in all of them. He's winning by a combination, I checked the numbers, 275,000 votes. So you'd have to turn around tens of thousands of votes across 3 states to turn around the election. So the Trump people don't pretend that that's possible anymore. Their only path now is to somehow delegitimize the entire election in 3 states and have it thrown into the House of Representatives. Well, we're talking about sort of crazy scenarios. So why are we doing this? Well, I think we're doing this because I think there is a desire by President Trump to delegitimize the Trump administration. And let's be fair to the president. If you're President Trump, you've been through 4 years in which you believe, and with some justification, that Democrats never accepted the legitimacy of your election. They tried to not only delegitimize you, but throw you out of office for 4 years. And so now it's payback time. And that's part of the poison in the American political system right now, is that everybody gets payback for what the other guy did 2 years ago. So I understand that, but that's, I think, what we're talking about here. And I think we're talking about keeping the Trump base engaged and energized on behalf of Trumpism and Trump, as we were discussing earlier. The problem with that is that you will have millions of people, and I'm sure you get the same kinds of emails I do, Colleen, of people who already have accepted the Trump argument that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. That's not good for the country. And that's just where we are right now. So then the other part of your question is how's Joe Biden handling it? Well, frankly, I think he's been pretty much pitch perfect handling this since the election. And look, Joe Biden, and you covered him, I covered him for a long time. I like him a lot. He's a flawed figure in many ways, as we all are. He's 77 years old. He's probably lost a step, but I think he's been pitch perfect since this happened. He didn't, as you say, didn't have his hair on fire. He's basically counseled calm and patience. And he's basically now decided, well, I'm just going to move ahead. I know how this movie ends, and I'm just going to move ahead and do what I got to do. And I think that's the right way to handle it. It's the way that he can differentiate the way he's approaching the presidency from the way Donald Trump did. And that works to his benefit. So I think that's maybe the only choice he has. He could scream and holler a lot more, but I think he's doing himself some good by not doing that.
Well, so during the last 4 years, we've seen that Republicans in Congress have been remarkably consistent in their unwillingness to criticize Donald Trump or to suggest that a false claim from the president is indeed false. And obviously, we're seeing that they're sticking with that strategy right now, even as Trump undermines faith in our elections and tries to, as you say, delegitimize the Biden administration. I think for people who don't live in Washington, there are questions about why that is and whether there's such a thing as a bridge too far for Republicans with Trump. And will any of them at any point call on him to concede or suggest that perhaps he should not attack Iran during the final weeks of his presidency, or will they just continue to give him cover?
Well, this is 4 years of searching for that bridge too far and not finding it yet, right? So that's kind of where we are. And then you ask yourself why. Well, I think part of this is loyalty to the party, just in pure form. I think part of it is, and I think this is underappreciated. Let me step back for a second. The most powerful force in American politics today isn't what you're for or who you're with, but that you're against the other guy. And most people define their political position almost as much by who they're against as who they're for. And I think there are a lot of Republicans in Congress who are really appalled at some of the things Democrats have done over the last few years. They were appalled at the Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings, and they were appalled at the impeachment process, and they were appalled at Adam Schiff and the Russian dossier and all that stuff. And so there's a kind of an impulse to stand with Trump, even though maybe I can't stand him. But I'm standing with him against those guys, and I'm not standing with him. I'm standing with him against those guys. And there's a kind of a tribal element to American politics right now that's very troubling, but that takes precedence over what you actually might believe in some cases. And I think there's an element of that as well. And there's a fear factor. I mean, look, we all know this. There is a fear of crossing Donald Trump that, he's got an arm. It's not just that he's got a Twitter feed, which he does. He's got an army of people out there who are prepared to pounce. And he mobilizes them, and everybody in Congress knows that. I was at a dinner with a senator. I guess it was off the record, so I shouldn't name the name, but somebody who has been willing to speak up against President Trump. And he said, "You would not believe how quickly I get attacked back home if I say the slightest thing that appears to be critical of the president, or even if I'm not supportive of the president. I get hammered immediately." And for now, that continues to be the case. When will that not be the case? I don't know. But for now, I think most Republicans are saying what Mitch McConnell kind of says explicitly: this is going to work out. Keep calm. We're going to get to a point where there's going to be an electoral college vote, and then we'll have a president, and it will all proceed normally. And I think that's pretty much what Republicans are telling themselves. Like, this is going to work out. I don't need to get myself in a jam right now, because this is going to work out, and I don't have to be the person who makes it happen that way. And, I just hope nothing terrible happens in the meantime.
Right. And so for now, the go-to move remains, I didn't see the tweet. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Cory Gardner, by the way, just as a kind of amusing footnote, Cory Gardner, who's the now defeated Republican senator from Colorado, was asked on the Hill yesterday by somebody, "Do you think Joe Biden is president-elect?" And he said, "Stop with your trick questions."
That was amazing.
Trick question now? It's like, okay, fine, but whatever.
Seems pretty straightforward. You touched on this earlier, the fact that November 3rd really wasn't that great of a night for Democrats. Obviously, they won the White House, but they fell far short of their predictions that they would build on their majority in the House, that they would take control of the Senate. And as you noted, we're still waiting on the Georgia runoffs, but there was no blue wave by any stretch of the imagination on November 3rd. And so I'm interested in talking a little bit more about what you think went wrong for Democrats and what lessons they should learn from this election.
Well, look, I think the first lesson is, and this is the one that some moderate Democrats like Abigail Spanberger, the moderate congresswoman from Florida, who actually held onto her seat barely, articulated right away, which is we moved too far left. We let people call us socialists. That's why we didn't win Florida for Joe Biden. And we looked like we were the party that's in favor of defunding police. And in my district, that's a serious problem for me. And we got to stay more in the center. And that's the first thing I think that they learned. And then there are people in the left wing of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, who don't accept that. But I think that's demonstrably true. And I think that's the first thing they needed to learn. The second thing they kind of have to figure out, I think, and there's going to be a lot of discussion of this, why is it that Donald Trump, of all people, actually showed more appeal than was expected among Black men and among Hispanics in general? How did that happen? Because I think Democrats and a lot of other people assumed that 4 years of rhetoric about illegal aliens and send them back and they're rapists and they're murderers and drug dealers was going to turn off the Hispanic community to such a degree that it would be a wipeout. Well, it wasn't. Donald Trump won Florida because he did well in the Hispanic community there. And you can argue that the Florida Hispanic community is different because there's a lot of Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans. But he also did well in South Texas, where it's traditional Mexicans and Central American immigrants. there's a part of the Democratic message that just didn't work with them, and I think it's partly because those groups, that Hispanic populace tends to be culturally conservative. It doesn't like socialism. Some of them came from countries where they think they saw socialism and they didn't like it. And they kind of like a strong leader, I think. But also, and I think maybe more importantly, they kind of thought the Trump economic message maybe did work for them, because to the extent it's directed at working class whites, it's also directed at working class Hispanics. And so I think protecting their jobs from foreign interference has some resonance for them as well as for whites. So I think Democrats have to worry about that as well. And then I think there's an interesting question, and the Dole Institute or somebody ought to actually start thinking about how to dig deeper on this. One of the weird things that happened this year was Democrats had a bigger financial advantage than ever before in any election I've ever been associated with, and I've been associated with every one since 1980. They just brought in almost unlimited amounts of money, so they had a huge advertising advantage, and it didn't make much difference. It really didn't make much difference. So why is that? I don't know the answer to that question, but for some reason, activating a donor base, a small donor base of Democrats, wasn't enough to tip the balance in some of these races.
I think you make a really good point about just kind of this was a gut check moment for the Democratic Party this year in terms of, do we want to be the more moderate party of Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar, or the way more liberal party of Bernie Sanders and AOC? And as you say, we got some answers on what works, and Joe Biden prevailed not only in the Democratic primary, but also in winning the White House. It certainly doesn't seem like the Bernie Sanders and the AOCs of the Democratic Party are going to stand down. And so I'm interested in how you think Biden should kind of manage that situation, because as you know, defunding the police is not a winning message. The Green New Deal has not been a winning message. What can Biden do to kind of tamp that down?
Well, I'll tell you what, the biggest advantage that Joe Biden will have in that regard is if Republicans retain control of the Senate. I mean, I have talked to some Democrats privately who think that's the best thing that could happen for the Biden administration. Why? Because then he doesn't have to be the one who says no to the party's left wing. He can say, look, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants him to raise the top tax rate to 70%. All he has to do is say, look, I would love to do that, but look, I got to deal with Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate. They're never going to let me get away with that. They're the bad guys here, not me. That's actually a pretty beneficial alignment for Joe Biden in many ways, because as I said at the beginning, I believe he wants to keep his flag planted more or less in the center, or at least the center left of the spectrum. And I think he sees great peril in going too far left. And in a way, the fact Republicans did well on election night on November 3rd, and the fact that they're probably going to retain control of the Senate, is the best thing for Joe Biden to maintain a check on the progressive wing of his own party. Having said that, I think he's going to have to make some moves in that direction. I think he's going to have to make a couple of cabinet picks that please people on the left of his party. He's probably also going to want to pick a Republican, by the way, John Kasich, or maybe a couple of Republicans, to kind of create a physical demonstration that his talk about wanting to work with the other side is real. It's not phony. But I think mostly he's going to pick personnel who will help him keep that flag planted in the center of the spectrum. And then he's going to have some fights with the left wing of his own party as he moves down that path.
So you wrote in your Wall Street Journal column last week about the unsubstantiated charges of voter fraud and the stress that puts on our system. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of damage you think is being done at this moment, and what needs to happen now to restore confidence in democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is a dangerous long-term problem for both parties, because look, I mean, I just went through the list of areas in which Republicans did very well this year, but they're being told that the election in which they did well was an illegitimate and fake and fraudulent election. Well, they don't want that any more than Democrats do. So I think everybody has an interest in seeing faith in the system restored after the pummeling it's taking right now. So I don't think that's a partisan issue. I think that's a bipartisan issue. And I think that one of the things, and by the way, the two of the states that we've been talking about, are Arizona and Georgia, have Republican governors. So it's not like this is like a red versus blue thing. This is a Trump campaign versus the world kind of a situation. And I actually think, as I wrote in that column, I think there are some things that can happen at the federal level that help states and local governments make the argument that they're doing this the right way. And by the way, we've just been through a weird election in which there was way more early voting and way more mail-in voting than ever before. And so we moved into a new place, and that makes people uneasy, and it opens the system up to charges it's not working well. But it's also a sign of the future. Elections are not going to go back to the way they were before. I mean, we were already moving toward more mail balloting, more early balloting. We just sped it up by about 20 years in one season here. So this is going to be the way elections are going to be held, I believe. And everybody needs to make voters confident that they're doing it right. How could that happen? Well, I think one of the things that could happen is you could have a kind of a federal commission of some kind that establishes standards for states to follow and local governments to follow in collecting, verifying, and securing mail ballots, for example. You could have federal help. I mean, real dollars go out to states and localities to buy the machinery to help them count these, to verify and count early and mail ballots more efficiently. Things that would actually just make the nuts and bolts of the system work better so that people didn't worry about it so much. And I think that there's a federal role in doing that. I also think there's a federal role in just people getting together and delivering the message. We actually have a democracy that works here, and we Democrats and Republicans alike believe that. And you can't do it right now because you have the President of the United States screaming that the system is rigged. But I guarantee you, Republicans who barely won elections this year in blue states like California don't think this system was rigged. So they just need to get together and say that. So, I think this is a long-term problem, but there are fixes to it, and I think it's probably incumbent on everybody once the dust settles to figure out ways to do that.
And certainly disheartening when voting becomes a partisan issue. And, certainly it seems like we should be able to reach some sort of consensus around the idea that we want everyone to vote, or as many people to vote as possible.
Right. And just as a footnote there, we should be celebrating the fact that we will end up having about 155 million Americans vote. And that is way more than ever before. And it's going to be close to it won't be the highest percentage of the voting age population or the eligible vote ever, but it's going to be pretty close. That should be cause for celebration in a democracy, not a sign of some kind of weakness or flaw. And we just got to get there as a country, I think.
Exactly. I want to touch on one more topic before turning our attention to your book. For journalists, I think that one of the most troubling aspects of the last few weeks and the last few years, for that matter, has been the traction that totally debunked claims continue to get. And we're seeing that now with the assertions that there was widespread voter fraud when we haven't actually seen evidence of widespread voter fraud. What do you think that we need to do as a profession and as a country to address that issue? And is it actually possible to get back to a place where facts matter?
Well, I think what we need to do as a profession is just stick to our principles and stick to our business, and deal in facts, deal in objective truth, and just absorb the attacks you get. And this as well as I do, the attacks you get for simply stating facts. It's a remarkable thing, but it's where we are right now. And a lot of this is just intimidation. I think that people who send you screaming emails complaining about what you said know that what you've said is factually correct, but they're trying to intimidate you. This is a little like the fans or the players screaming at an umpire because they didn't like a call he made. He's not going to change that call, and they may even think he made the right call, but maybe they'll get the advantage of the next call. So there's a certain intimidation factor here. So I think the only thing that we can do as journalists is stick to our business, do it the right way, remain objective, don't become partisans, and don't choose sides. And understand that in this environment we're in right now, you have to defend the truth, and you also have to be prepared to be attacked for simply stating things that are factually correct and simply true. And kind of think we'll get through this. I personally think, I believe I know that there's a lot of stuff that President Trump says that he knows isn't true, and he knows that it's not true as he's saying it, but he says it because it serves various other purposes. It changes the debate. It diverts attention from other people. It kind of attracts and appeals to his base, even though they know it's not really true either. And it's become a bit of a game, and I think that's dangerous. But I just think what we need to do as a country, and what we particularly need to do as journalists, is simply continue to do our jobs right. don't waver from principles and standards, and just have confidence that in the end, truth does win out.
I know a lot of journalists feel a lot of pressure from Trump critics to be more aggressive and, calling a lie, or, pushing back. And I mean, I remember talking with you and in the Wall Street Journal newsroom and newsrooms everywhere have had this conversation. I think such an important point is that journalists shouldn't become the story. We should tell the story, and we should not become advocates and make ourselves characters in this narrative.
Exactly. And that's critical. And the temptation to make yourself part of the story is always there for a journalist. It's more there now than ever before. But it's not about us. And it's not a narrative about us. It is about us saying this is true, but this isn't true. And being basically the referee on the field that most Americans expect a free press to be.
So I did want to talk about your book, We Should Have Seen It Coming, which is so perfect for this moment and is a lot of food for thought about just kind of how the Republican Party arrived at this moment. And in the book, you trace kind of the political arc from Reagan to Trump and the Republican Party. I know this is an unfair question that kind of asks you to summarize 250 pages in one answer, but just to kind of set the stage for folks who have not yet read the book, could you provide in broad strokes kind of how the conservative movement that Reagan ushered in eventually led us to Donald Trump's populist movement?
Well, it's actually not that hard to do because it's summarized in the title of the book. I mean, the title of the book is We Should Have Seen It Coming. And really what I wanted to do, what I was trying to do after 2016, like so many people were, to figure out how did this happen? How did Donald Trump become president of the United States? Not that it was a good or bad thing, but it was just so totally unexpected and such a total departure from the norm. How did it happen? And so the book was an attempt to go back and answer that question by tracing the arc of the conservative movement, which I think was in many ways the most important and the most interesting political movement of the last 4 decades, from Reagan to Trump. Because whatever Donald Trump may be, he's not really a conservative. I mean, Newt Gingrich told me that flat out. He said he's not a conservative. He's an anti-liberal. And how did that happen? And what he is a populist and a nationalist. And those are two things that Ronald Reagan was not. Ronald Reagan had a view of immigration that was embodied by the fact that he delivered the speech opening the general election of his presidential campaign in 1980, his successful one, but delivering a speech at the Statue of Liberty extolling the virtues of immigration and how it had enriched America and improved our economic well-being. Well, you go from there to Donald Trump. How did that happen? Well, what I concluded was there were a lot of milestones along the way that told you that the Republican Party was changing, the country was changing, and the view of Washington was changing in ways that kind of made a Donald Trump almost inevitable. And you can go back to Pat Buchanan, who was saying in the early 1990s almost exactly what Donald Trump was saying in 2016. Free trade is killing us, immigration's taking jobs away, we need to stop this economic globalization is killing us. And then you had Ross Perot saying similar things. And then you had Sarah Palin, who came out of that same kind of cultural milieu as the vice presidential nominee in 2008. And then you had the Tea Party in 2009 and 2010. And by then it was really starting to crystallize. And then the Republicans decided after Mitt Romney lost, we needed to do something different, but they didn't think the different was going to be Donald Trump. But at that point, he kind of walked through an open door. Why did that happen? Well, I think it happened because there was legitimate economic grievance in the Republican Party about the traditional formulas. A lot of working class Americans had moved into the Republican Party over the years for cultural reasons. They didn't like Democrats' the policies on abortion or gay rights or guns or immigration as a cultural issue. And so they became Republicans for cultural reasons, but they looked at this party they had basically taken over and said, well, the economic recipe here doesn't work for me. Like, I'm not benefiting from economic globalization. Corporations are. I'm not benefiting from free trade. The factory I worked at just got shut down. And oh, by the way, when I went down the street to try to get a job at the fast food place, a Mexican immigrant had taken that job before me. So they looked at the traditional conservative economic message and said, this doesn't work for me. Donald Trump kind of sensed that and walked through the door and said, yeah, you're right. And so that's kind of what happened. And by the way, Occupy Wall Street on the left and Bernie Sanders is not that far removed. There's a kind of a populist, the game is rigged view that a lot of Americans have right now, that the elites are benefiting culturally, socially, and economically, and we're not. And I think Donald Trump basically took advantage of that. And that's how we got to Trump. But it's also why, again, to go back to where we were earlier, why I don't think Trumpism just magically goes away because he's not president anymore.
Well, you mentioned a lot of the figures who got us from Reagan to Trump. One of the other prominent figures in your book is Newt Gingrich, and you note in the book that Gingrich actually was on the very short list of VP possibilities for Donald Trump, which is an interesting through line from there to here. How did Newt Gingrich lay some of the really early groundwork in this Republican revolution that culminates with Trump?
Well, Gingrich is a fascinating figure, and there's a fair amount of the book in the middle that's devoted to Gingrich because I think he's really important. He was, in a way, he basically consolidated the Reagan Revolution. You can argue that the Reagan Revolution, the conservative movement, reached its peak of power in 1994 when Newt Gingrich led the takeover of the House, which was a shocking development at the time. And then for a couple of years after, he consolidated power in the Republican Party and also pushed the Democratic Party to the right. And Bill Clinton understood that, and he allowed the party to be moved to the right. So I think Gingrich was probably the consolidator of the Reagan Revolution and the guy who actually brought it to its peak of power, but also the person who ended the Reagan Revolution. I quote Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, in the book, who worked with and against Gingrich, as saying basically that's when the Reagan Revolution ended, because that was the end of the kind of the happy, optimistic, sunny version of conservatism and the more angry, hard-edged, and kind of grievance-driven version of it that Newt Gingrich embodied. And so I think that was a problem because it changed the tone of the conservative movement. And then I think third, that his own personal foibles kind of brought down his downfall. And that was why I think the Gingrich period turned out to be, while important, relatively short-lived, because, as he told me, I talked to Gingrich a couple of times for the book, and as he told me in one of those conversations, he said, I was no Ronald Reagan. That was my problem. I couldn't bring people together. I turned people off. He was, for Newt Gingrich, it was a moment of remarkable self-awareness, I would say.
I think it's really interesting to read this book and see how all the dots connect over this span of 40 years from Reagan to Trump. And despite your argument that we should, in fact, have seen it coming, clearly a lot of Republicans and a lot of non-Republicans never saw this coming. I'm interested in whether you can point to a few key points along this arc for the GOP where if Republican leaders or voters had made a different decision, they might have ventured down a different path that hewed more closely to kind of our parents' Republican Party.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I figured out along the way, which I didn't appreciate at the time, was that if you're looking for points along the arc of this 40-year story, where you could see that the Republicans were heading into trouble, every one of those involved immigration. I think immigration, if you step back and look at it, is the issue that showed the party really couldn't stay on the same path. You had three straight Republican presidents or presidential nominees who tried to fix the immigration problem by supporting a comprehensive immigration reform. You had George W. Bush tried to do it. You had John McCain championed it, and in part may have lost the presidency because he got crossways with his own party by trying to do it. And Mitt Romney tried to do it. And every one of them basically ran into a machine gun fire in his own party. And I think immigration and the failure to come to terms with immigration as a party was really one of the reasons that the populist movement took root and built up as much as it did. I think if somebody along the way, and I give George W. Bush a lot of credit for this, he really saw this and really did try to do a comprehensive immigration reform, but the politics had turned. I also, I remember, for example, Sam Brownback, who was a senator from Kansas, obviously, and he was running for president in 2008. And I remember going to his office and doing an interview with him in 2007. And he said, basically, and I mentioned this in the book, he said, I've stopped going to Iowa because I believe in a Reagan-esque view of immigration, that it's good for the country. And every time I go to Iowa now, all I do is get into arguments about immigration, and I'm not going to do that anymore. So I think immigration was the issue that should have told all of us that something had happened at the base of the party. And interestingly, the party establishment tried in 2012 to move in the opposite direction, to say, oh, well, we need to win more Hispanic votes, so we have to embrace comprehensive immigration reform, and we need to be more friendly to Hispanics and immigrants. And Donald Trump walked through the door and said, "No, we don't. I'm going to do the opposite of that." So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing that the other point along the way where I think something could have been done differently was in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial collapse, when I think a lot, and this is where the Tea Party came from in some respects, there were a lot of grassroots populist Republicans, people who were then Republicans, had arrived at the party and thought, well, I lost my house, my neighbor lost his house, I lost my job, I don't see anybody on Wall Street paying a price. That makes me mad. And a lot of that is where the Tea Party came from. And I think the Republican Party probably at that point could have adjusted a little bit to take into account the anger at its own grassroots base, but it didn't really do that.
So I do want to leave time for audience questions. I have a couple more questions, but if folks who are watching have questions, go ahead and start typing them into the YouTube chat, and we'll come to you shortly. Jerry, you conclude your book with a chapter that asks the question, what now? And in the last paragraph of the book, you quote Senator Ted Cruz arguing that conservatives need to decouple their efforts from the, quote, cult of personality. And obviously you wrote that before the November election. Now that you've seen the results, does that change your assessment of where the Republican revolution goes from here, or should go from here?
Well, no, I'm actually kind of glad now that I closed with that quote, because that is actually that's the question, really, is this still the party of Trump? And I didn't use the term cult of personality. He didn't put Trump's name to it, but it's clear that's what he was talking about. Is that the path forward for Republicans, or do they need to detach from Trump himself while not detaching from some elements of Trumpism? And I think that's the big question. And to go back to an earlier part of this conversation, the corollary question is, will Donald Trump let the party detach itself from him? Or is he going to be in New York or Florida or wherever he lands, keeping score, settling scores, and basically intimidating people in the party to make sure that allegiance remains to Donald J. Trump, not to some sort of more abstract idea? So I think that's in a way what Senator Cruz, without knowing exactly, obviously, everything that would happen over the ensuing 2 years since we had that initial conversation, he didn't know what was going to happen, but I think he had a sense of it. And that's what he was saying. Like, let's, and Ted Cruz, by the way, is a much more traditional Reagan-esque conservative than a Trump one. But I think what he was saying was, let's acknowledge some of what Trump has brought to the party and the way he has changed the party for its own good, but not make that dependent on a guy who has got plenty of baggage and, who, by the way, Ted Cruz once called a pathological liar.
Right. There is that. So I can't have a Dole Institute conversation with you without asking you about your home state of Kansas and its politics and the November 3rd election in Kansas. It was interesting because obviously Kansas and the US Senate race in Kansas got a fair amount of national attention this year. I don't think anyone really thought Kansas was actually going to be a swing state, but there was a whole lot of prognosticating suggesting that the Senate race was really close, and maybe, just maybe, if everything went Barbara Bollier's way, she could eke out a win. But in the end, it wasn't even close. And Roger Marshall won by 12 points. Trump won by even more than that, 15 points in Kansas. Was that just wishful thinking? Is Kansas just as Republican as ever? Or how did you read what happened in Kansas?
Well, I kind of read it, and you know better than me, so I'm hesitant to pontificate here too much. But I'll tell you what my theory is. My theory has been for a while in Kansas that it's a very Republican state down deep, and Republicans come home in presidential election years. And that's just kind of what happens. And it doesn't mean Democrats can't win. It means it's hard to win in an election year where you have a very polarized electorate and people are basically feel like they need to suit up for the home team. And for most Kansans, a majority of Kansans now, that's still the Republican Party. So I think there's a kind of a reflexive element to it. That's the first thing. The second thing, and this I don't know, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not, I have a sense, a feeling that the Democrats in Kansas were hurt by the sense that Americans got, not just in Kansas but elsewhere, that the Democratic Party was moving too far to the left. That, socialism became kind of the cliche term, but whatever that means, that there was fear of the Democratic Party, which drove people more toward the Republican category. And again, this goes back to a point I made earlier. The most powerful thing in American politics today isn't who you're for, but who you're against. And I think a lot of Kansans, like a lot of Americans in some of these congressional districts we've been talking about, knew they were against the Democrats because they were afraid of the Democrats. And that's a problem I think the Democratic Party has to get its arms around. And it's going to be hard for them to do that. The third thing is a question I have about Kansas, which isn't just true about Kansas, but it's kind of true in general. I mean, Democrats had a huge financial advantage, right? I mean, they bought, apparently, I'm told, they bought ads wall to wall for most of their candidates, and certainly for the Senate candidacy. It just didn't make any difference. And it's, by the way, not only in Kansas was that true, it was true in Maine and other places. So there's an interesting corollary here, and I mentioned this earlier. Why doesn't campaign advertising move the needle as much as we all think it does, or that we believe it used to? I don't know, but I think Kansas stands out at the moment as a pretty good case study, and that's the reality right now.
Yeah, that was a huge money advantage, and it did not help. And 12 points is a lot to lose by when you had that much money. I thought that one notable aspect of the results in Kansas was the fact that Wichita looks a lot more Republican than it had in the recent past. And Laura Kelly won Sedgwick County when she won the governor's race. Barbara Bollier did not win Sedgwick County, and if Wichita is going to be that Republican, it seems awfully tough to win as a Democrat in Kansas if essentially Wyandotte County, Johnson County is a little bit blue, and Douglas County, if those are the only blue counties in all of Kansas.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I grew up in Hayes and Ellis County, and when I grew up, you couldn't be elected dog catcher as a Republican in Ellis County, and I think it went 72% for Trump. So, there's a and as we have seen in some states, we saw it in Florida this year, that even smaller, less populous counties, if county after county after county provides a big margin for Republicans, well, it's not Johnson County, but eventually it adds up. And that's kind of the Trump formula in state after state. And it's kind of what happens in Kansas, I think, right now.
Exactly. Well, so we have a question from the audience. Angie asks, are Trumpism and Bernieism just alternative ways to address the concerns of the same group of disaffected voters?
That's a very smart question. And to some extent, the answer is yes, absolutely. There was one of the interesting phenomena in 2016 was the overlap of Bernie voters in the primaries and Trump voters in the general. There were a lot of Bernie voters who moved over and voted for Trump in 2016. I think that didn't happen as much this time, but there's still a reality there that basically there's a kind of an anti-globalist, anti-corporate, anti-establishment vein that runs through Bernie Sanders supporters that is not that dissimilar from the same vein that runs through Trump supporters. And it is a kind of to coin a phrase, the system's rigged against me. I mean, Donald Trump tells people that explicitly, and so does Bernie Sanders. He tells people that explicitly. And, you saw Donald Trump run advertisements, millions of dollars in advertisements this year, saying the big pharmaceutical companies are out to get you. They're going to screw you. Bernie Sanders has been saying that for 50 years. So at some point, these two things come together. It's kind of the same way there were similar roots between the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the 2008-2009 period. So look, at some point, populism isn't an ideology, it's an attitude. And it's an attitude that is shared by both Trump supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters, at least to some extent.
Another question from the audience, Jeremy asks, and I'm not sure that I agree with him, but I'll see what you think. He says that election experts document election fraud based on machine rigging that's being perpetrated against Democratic voters on a major scale. Why do you think DNC leaders now and prior, such as John Kerry, who was fully aware of election fraud evidence in 2004, publicly or ignore or suppress this highly credible analysis?
I just don't know what the evidence is for that, to be honest with you. I mean, besides, let's distinguish between fraud and malfunctions and human error. Most of the examples that have popped up so far are first of all, small scale, and have more to do with, machines not functioning right or humans not working them right. And trust me, I screw up my computer regularly, so I appreciate this. Not fraud. And there's just, it is an assertion that's thrown around a lot. And there's just, honestly, we've looked, I've read, I look at the lawsuits when they're filed. There are assertions without evidence. And it's just, even our own editorial page today, which is, very Trump friendly and hardly a place that lobbies for Democrats, said, where's the evidence for it? That's I think the problem here. There's also the question of even if there was fraud, you're talking about fraud at scale or even mistakes at scale. I talked to some election officials at the state level before this all happened. And what they will tell you is that there can be fraud, there can be illegally cast ballots, and there can be mistakes. But it's very hard to imagine a scenario in which those things happen at the scale you would need to turn an entire state outcome around, much less an entire country. Let's remember that in the recount in Florida in 2000, which was the most celebrated one, the whole dispute was about 500 votes. We're now talking, as I said before, about a difference in the vote for Joe Biden and Donald Trump across 6 states that amounts to 275,000 votes. It is not really possible, I believe, in our system to have fraud or even mistakes at that scale. And I think that's the disconnect in the conversation right now.
So Mark J asks, what are the politics of indicting or not indicting Trump after he leaves office? Obviously, this is a question that Biden is already contending with. All eyes are, of course, on the Southern District of New York. Help us think through this. Well,
you got the Southern District of New York, and you've got the Attorney General of New York, and so I think there's going to, how to say this. There are going to be people who think there should be prosecutions for campaign violations or business fraud post-election. And there's going to be, I believe, and I think you've seen the hints of this already, a gut instinct on the part of Joe Biden that we don't want to go there. That is not where we should want to be as a country. It's not where I want to be, because I don't want to the extent that we're in a business of settling scores or weaponizing the judicial and law enforcement system and the courts to settle political scores. That's not where I want to go. I want to actually end that kind of conversation in the country. So I think there's going to be some tension there. I don't know what to predict, because I don't know what Cy Vance in New York knows, or what the court cases will be. I just think that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to take a deep breath and say, do we really want to go there? Do we really want to go there? If you think it was wrong for people at Trump rallies to chant "lock her up" or "lock him up," well, that attitude's only going to increase if we go down that path. So I'm not advocating a position. I'm just saying I think that's it's risky territory, and I don't think that's where Joe Biden wants the nation's attention to be over the next 4 years.
Thank you. With that, we're just about out of time, even though I could ask you so many more questions. This has been a really interesting conversation. I want to thank Jerry Seib for sharing his insights. Thank you, Jerry, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You can, of course, read Jerry's column, the Capitol Journal column, in the Wall Street Journal, and his book is "We Should Have Seen It Coming: From Reagan to Trump, A Front Row Seat to Political Revolution." This is our final discussion about what has been an eventful and memorable campaign season. I want to thank the Dole Institute for hosting me this semester and for ensuring that we were able to transition smoothly to a digital event series. And you can find all of this fall's discussions archived on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining us today and for joining us during the last few months for Politics, Pandemic, and Protests from the Dole Institute at KU. Stay safe out there.